welcome to another weekly update. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, it's an interesting week this week just gone. I don't think there's loads and loads of news. There's a couple of things to talk through, but that's quite good because one of the things, well, actually both of the things to talk about today I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, and I usually run out of time. So yeah, should all be good. So we're going to cover two things today. First is a blog post that I did about declarative agents, and then the second thing is an update from Azure Communication Services. All right, so let's start with the first thing. I've been doing this series of blog posts about declarative agents, Copilot Declarative Agents, specifically the ones that use API plugins, because I find them really interesting. And I've been going through the sort of process of doing it. And in the last week, since the last update we did, I managed to get part 2 out. So now we have part 1 and part 2. I think it's going to be a 5-part series, I think. That's looking how it's kind of shaping up in the notes that I've got. So part 2 is all about prerequisites. And I wasn't sure whether to do this or not. I was kind of thinking about wrapping it into part 3, which is like, or part 4 maybe, around sort of showing the demo and then how to actually build it. The more I thought about it though, actually, a really big part of this whole process actually is the prerequisites. And what I mean by that is like the process of actually building a declarative Copilot is really quite straightforward, but it only makes sense and is straightforward in order to create something really good if you've got all the prerequisites in place. And the prerequisites aren't just like, having all the right packages on your machine, although that's a part of it. Let me just show you the blog post, because there's kind of two things I want you to take away from this blog post. The first is, yes, there's some prerequisites, and none of them are required. They just kind of make things easier around, like, yeah, you need Visual Studio Code, you need Teams Toolkit Intention, all that kind of stuff. So there's the kind of like what you'd expect from a prerequisites blog. The other thing, though, is that the thing that makes building Copilots with these APIs so easy is if you've got good APIs that are in the right structure. What do I mean by that? Well, right now, like, there are some limitations on the types of API you can call in terms of what authentication methods you can use and what the structure of those APIs look like, the structure of how you build up the request bodies and the response bodies. So what you might find is that you need to do a little bit of, finagling, a little bit of sculpting of your APIs. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. I think it really helps if you have a dedicated endpoint for your Copilot API that is not used by anything else, because it gives you the freedom, the flexibility to change things around to fit like how declarative agents like to work. Also, you can much more tightly scope your API as well. It's not really like a biggie because you can use the manifest files, so the OpenAPI spec, to kind of naturally scope for you. But for me, it helps if you have a dedicated API, and that can be an abstraction over your main API. You could use something like API management. Azure API management is a fantastic abstraction. Also gives you a lot more visibility about what's going on, gives you really good logging, gives you traceability. So for all those reasons, actually, it's another really good reason for having all that stuff in place. You can also combine lots of different API calls from different places into one kind of like single simplified abstraction API. Again, it makes working like what you do then later on down the line with Copilot makes things much easier. And the other biggie around these prerequisites is that your APIs need to have an OpenAPI spec file which describes your API. Now, if you're using a publicly available API, and if you look at all of Microsoft samples, of course, they go out to publicly available APIs. They all have nice OpenAPI spec files describing them. And that's great. That's good. And obviously, you should have the same. If you're like any other enterprise developer that I know, you probably don't have them because who's going to look at them, right? So, so there is some work to be done there in creating an OpenAPI spec. And there's a couple of different ways you can do it. I talked through a couple in the blog post, give you some pointers. My vote goes to Dev Proxy for generating an OpenAPI file for you. A couple of reasons. It's really easy. It's a nice, easy one. Like you load up Dev Proxy, you enable the plugin, and then you just use your API, and it like listens to your API being used, and then on the basis of that, it creates your OpenAPI file. Again, allows you to really tightly scope your API because you can just make sure you just run the API calls whilst Dev Proxy is recording that you want to use with Copilot, and that's all your OpenAPI file will contain as well. I also talk about Hidi as a Microsoft provided nice, simple command line tool that you can use to validate your APIs as well. All right. So those are kind of the prerequisites, and that's why I wanted to put a whole blog post into it, because actually there is quite a lot in there. If you do all those things right, steps like the following steps are actually really quite simple and very rewarding, actually, because you get all that stuff right, it kind of feels like magic when you then step into Copilot land and start using your APIs and talking to them. So that's that. I'm hopeful that the next part of the blog post will come out this week. Fingers crossed. Let's see how I go. Next thing I want to talk about, Azure Communication Services have a month-end update blog covering all the things they did in January. A couple of interesting things I thought to go through. So let's just go through. They've got an opt-out management API for SMS. This is nice. One of those kind of nice to have things that you wouldn't have thought of being part of, like the experience for Azure Communication Services. You wouldn't have thought that was in their wheelhouse, if you like to use a term. But it's really handy that it is there, because otherwise developers just have to, every developer has to build one of these. Every enterprise that uses SMS needs to think about opt-out. So it's nice that they've kind of addressed that as well, actually, if we did it, then we're saving, a bunch of time, because every other development team doesn't need to do this. So that's nice. And it's very open as well, so you can combine it with other data sources like CMSs and other workflows as well. It's not just about opting out of ACS SMSs. It's about like just SMS in general. So it's a nice open way of doing it. It's nicely implemented, as you can see. It's very nice abstraction for the SDK and things like that. So that's all kind of good. So that's interesting. And then this real-time texting is really cool, I think. Not new particularly, nice to see it wrapped up. So obviously there've been ways, like remember, like I'm old, so I remember these things like when SignalR first came out, and we were all very impressed by SignalR and this ability to real-time trade information. And that's really all this is. It's real-time text. It's a different way of sending and receiving text, where you don't wait until the person presses enter before sending it. You send it in real time. So that will be good for some scenarios. I don't know, like real-time transcription, translation being done by a human, for instance, might be very useful for that, or anywhere where the latency is really, really important and you want that much closer experience. You can implement it yourself. This real-time text thing is built in. It's coming soon. It's not quite there yet, I don't think. But it's going to be built into the SDK, into the calling SDK, so you can quite easily add it in. It's not like a big thing to think about. So if that's interesting, then yes. What's really interesting that I didn't realize is that apparently this real-time text thing is required in the EU under the European Accessibility Act. It needs to be there by June 2025. So that's really interesting. So all voice and video calling services in the EU are going to be required to support this. Really interesting. Yep. So that's kind of good to see. And then there's some other cool stuff as well around picture-in-picture for the iOS SDK, which I like, just to make it feel more like a nice iOS app as well. So that's good. And yeah, a couple of other things as well. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just a reminder that this team keep churning out really good stuff. And if you use Azure Communication Services for anything, it is worth like just checking back every now and again and seeing what's been added, because what you might find is that actually you can evolve your product actually quite well just by enabling features that they've already built for you, which is nice because it makes you look really good. Yeah. So I think that's everything for me this week. Like I said, this week, focus on trying to get those blog posts out. Next week, I think I'm going to really try and convert some of them to video. That would be really good, I think, and do some kind of video demos of some of the things I've been talking about. I think that would be valuable. Let me know what you think. Other than that, have a great week, whatever it is you're doing, and I will speak to you again next time.